Straight ahead on Law&Crime Daily. New details in the investigation of the Doomsday cult couple. Seeing photos of JJ Vallow in the days before police say he was murdered and buried.
He had duct tape continuously wrapped from elbow all the way around his arms, over his hands.
Rodney Reed's defense presents new evidence they say clears his name.
People believe more in finality than they do in justice.
The 2-week-long hearing underway as his defense argues for a new trial. And opening statements in the murder case that made America rethink rideshare safety. Did Nathaniel Rowland kill college student Samantha Josephson after she allegedly got into his car, thinking he was her Uber driver? Plus, Robert Durst's defense cross-examines the lead investigator who reopened the case into the disappearance of the millionaire's wife. What we know about Kathie Durst's presumed murder. Law&Crime Daily covering court cases from coast to coast. Welcome everyone to Law&Crime Daily. I'm Brian Buckmeyer along with Terry Austin. Police release a cache of documents with new details about the Doomsday cult couple investigation. Law&Crime's Anjanette Levy has been sifting through the records and is here with what she found.
Brian, these emails include more than 2,000 files that reveal new details about the disappearance and deaths of JJ Vallow and Tylee Ryan.
This photo shows JJ Vallow sitting on a couch on September 22nd, 2019. Investigators found the photo in Lori Vallow Daybell's iCloud account. JJ wearing red PJs the last day he was known to be alive. Nearly 9 months later, JJ's body was found buried in Chad Daybell's yard in Rexburg, Idaho. He was in plastic bags wearing those red pajamas.
He had the same style haircut that he had in the videos that I had seen and the photographs I had seen just prior to my welfare check with him in September.
A detective from Rexburg Police testified last year about what JJ's body looked like when it was buried.
His hands were folded like this, chest high. He had duct tape continuously wrapped from elbow all the way around his arms, over his hands.
Days before JJ died, photos of him were taken at a park. He was sitting on a ride. There were also photos of JJ with his older stepsister, Tylee Ryan. Tylee's remains were found in the same yard as her brothers, burned and dismembered. One of Lori Vallow's friends testified about the last time she saw JJ in September 2019 with Vallow's brother, Alex Cox.
He brought JJ into the house during the middle of the podcast.
Okay. And did you see him bring JJ into the house?
Yes.
Okay. How did Alex Cox bring JJ into the house?
He carried him in,
Okay.
and he was asleep.
Now, Alex Cox died of natural causes in December of 2019. His sister and Chad Daybell eventually went to Hawaii, where investigators kept tabs on them. And we'll have more on that coming up on our next edition of Law&Crime Daily. Brian.
Thanks, Anjanette. Joining us today is former prosecutor Melba Pearson and Terry Austin. Anjanette, 2,500 files is a lot. I do not envy you with that. What else is in the documents?
You know, there is a lot in those emails. A lot of them are correspondence between the investigators in Chandler, Arizona, and the FBI, because the FBI, of course, was involved in this case, searching for these children. And there are also emails and screen grabs of text messages, things like that, between JJ Vallow's grandmother, Kay Woodcock, and investigators. So she was incredibly concerned trying to find JJ and Tylee, and it's just heartbreaking to read all of that.
Absolutely heartbreaking. Melba, could this information dump be a sign we are closer to hearing a cause of death? And why do you think that hasn't been made public yet?
So the only logical reason that I can think of that would necessitate not releasing the cause of death is because the investigation is ongoing. If they're still talking to witnesses, if they think that if they were to say, well, listen, this was the cause of death, that could affect somebody's potential testimony, they're going to hold off on releasing that for as long as possible to make sure they get as much evidence as possible and to make sure that the evidence they get, the witness testimony, is not tainted in some way by the extensive media coverage as well as aspects of the cause of death. We want to make sure that we're getting information that only the killer would know, as we've seen a lot in television and, of course, from watching Law and Crime. There's certain information that police will often hold back from the public so that when they are able to verify someone's testimony, they can match it up with the facts that they know to be true, as opposed to people, giving false testimony because they saw something on TV or they want to help or, for any of a number of reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. Terry, what are your thoughts about Melanie Gibbs' testimony and the last time she saw JJ?
Yeah, Brian, I think that was very odd that JJ was being carried over Alex's shoulder. JJ was 7 at the time, and it seems a little odd that he was, quote unquote, asleep, as Melanie testified. She was there doing the podcast in Lori's house between September 19th and 23rd, and the last time JJ was seen was on the 22nd, reported missing on the 23rd. So it's a coincidence, but it seems to me that maybe he might have been even drugged at that time. Of course, he could have been asleep, but he could have been dead. So I don't know.
Yeah. Still a lot of questions, even after that 2,500-page dump of information. In this case, we'll continue to follow the Doomsday cult couple case as it progresses. Thank you, everyone. Turning now to other top legal news, convicted rapist Harvey Weinstein is in California facing more sexual assault charges. He could spend the rest of his life in prison if found guilty. Weinstein was extradited from New York State Prison on Tuesday, where he is serving a 23-year sentence for rape and sexual assault. He is facing 11 charges in Los Angeles related to 5 different incidents at Beverly Hills hotels between 2004 and 2013. If convicted, Weinstein faces up to 140 years in prison. New documents reveal how the FBI hired serial killer James Whitey Bulger as an informant before he fled from Boston in the 1970s. It happened when Bulger received a tip from an FBI agent that the agency was close to indicting him. The 300 pages of information also detail the agency's investigation into Bulger, including cases of loan sharking, fixing a horse race in Pennsylvania, and drug deals around Boston in the 70s. He was convicted in 11 murders in 2013 and sentenced to 2 full life terms. He was killed inside a West Virginia prison hours after being transferred in 2018. 5 members of the disgraced rap artist security team are indicted for allegedly chasing down and robbing a man of his phone. One of the suspects, a former NYPD detective, is also charged with falsely reporting the incident. Manhattan's district attorney says a 5-person team protecting Tekashi 6ix9ine chased down the 34-year-old victim when he took out his phone to film the rapper in Harlem last year. The officer reported multiple times the victim threatened the 5 men with a gun, but investigators found no evidence of the claim. Still ahead on Law and Crime Daily, opening statements in the fake Uber driver murder trial. But first, Rodney Reed gets a new day in court. The evidence his defense says clears his name and the suspect they're now pointing fingers at in the murder of a young woman. Next. Welcome back. A special hearing is underway in the Rodney Reed case. Defense attorneys say they have new evidence that could prove his innocence.
When Rodney Reed was on trial, it was not fair. The testimony was wrong.
Jared Adams is part of a team of attorneys from the Innocence Project, hoping to convince a Texas judge that Rodney Reed deserves a new trial.
If this was about getting it right, then both sides would agree that we should test everything, interview every witness to make sure that we got it right.
For more than 2 decades, Reed sat on death row, convicted of the 1996 rape and murder of Stacey Stites. His execution was stayed by a Texas Court of Criminal Appeals in 2019. His case was remanded back to the Bastrop trial court. Reed maintains his innocence, and his defense says many of the state's experts called at trial have since recanted. On day 1 of the hearing, his defense called Dr. Andrew Baker, the chief medical examiner in Hennepin County, who testified at Derek Chauvin's trial about George Floyd's autopsy. Baker says he believes Stites died much earlier than the state presented at trial. A group of renowned forensic pathologists, including Dr. Michael Bodden, signed off on an independent study saying the state's timeline is medically impossible.
And she was lying in such a position that the lividity on the front of her chest meant that she had been face down the time she was in her residence with her fiancé. for 4 or 5 hours.
But crime scene investigators say Stites was found face up on her back. The defense points to her fiancé, Jimmy Fennell, a former police officer, as an alternative suspect.
He was tried and convicted for the same type of offense, kidnapping and raping a woman.
On day 2 of the hearing, the defense called Arthur Snow, a former inmate who served time with Fennell. Snow signed a sworn affidavit saying Fennell approached him in 2019 wanting protection from the Aryan Brotherhood and confessed that his fiancée had been sleeping around with a black man behind his back, using a racial slur, saying, "I had to kill the N-word," loving fiancé. On cross, Snow pleaded the fifth when pressed by the prosecution about his account. The defense plans to call more inmates who also say Fennell confessed to them. And for Adams, an exoneree turned lawyer, this hearing is about getting to the truth.
And I'll just tell you this. When someone is going through something like this in prison, it is easy to have yourself filled with doubt. But I could not go on that way. I lived each day like I was getting out the next. And I promised myself if I was successful, I would become a part of this to help it. And that's what I've done by becoming an attorney.
Let's bring back former prosecutor Melba Pearson and Terry Austin. Melba, with so many witnesses recanting, is there anything the prosecution can rely on in this hearing?
The only thing that the prosecution really has going for them is any physical evidence or any statements that may have been made at the time of the offense. But with all of these high-profile, experts coming out saying that this is medically impossible, there were other letters that could have spoken to the consensual nature of the relationship that he had with the victim. All of these things are not going to weigh in the prosecution's favor. This is not really looking good for them.
Yeah, Terry, let's talk about some of those experts. How did Dr. Baker hold up after being crossed by the prosecution? Did his findings at the timing of Stites' death make sense?
Dr. Baker held up extremely well, and I think that his findings were logical, even to a layperson. He said he had serious qualms about the timing of the death of the victim, as you mentioned. And he explained that the state of the victim at the time of her death wasn't consistent with what the prosecution had said. He said that the length of time that the sperm is in the body wasn't consistent. He said that he disputed the bruises on her body. And he also talked about the pooling of the blood, Brian. So all of these things really were logical. They made sense. And I think that the jury and a layperson and the judge and anyone else involved listening to this type of testimony will believe and understand that the timing is just off. It just wasn't right.
It's all about timing here. The prosecution's case rested a lot on that. As this hearing continues, we'll make sure to bring you updates to see whether or not Rodney Reed gets a new trial or is vindicated by this information. Thank you both. Coming up on Law and Crime Daily, the jury seated in the case of a man accused of posing as a rideshare driver before killing a college student. Plus, Robert Durst on trial, where fact meets fiction. The Hollywood movies played for the jury and the real-life investigators taking the stand ahead. Welcome back. Jurors in the Robert Durst trial are watching the movie All Good Things, which is loosely based off the defendant's life. This comes after we learn the movie's directors will not be testifying. Robert Durst is accused of killing his best friend Susan Berman in December 2000. Prosecutors say he plotted to kill Berman after she threatened she'd go public with information about the 1982 disappearance of his first wife, Kathie. New York State Police investigator Joseph Becerra reopened Kathie's case in 1999 and says he was planning to speak with Berman when he learned she was killed. But Durst's defense maintains there's no evidence linking Durst to either death.
But at no time did you find any physical evidence showing that Mr. Durst had talked to Susan Berman to plot any kind of strategy for Mr. Durst as far as an alibi, did you?
That is correct.
Do you know where the rumor or the theory that Susan Berman had called the school began?
Objection, relevance, also calling for hearsay, also outside scope.
Mr. State, were you in meetings with the LADA? Where the LADA or the LAPD suggested that Ms. Berman had called the medical school? You recall
Objection,
that?
relevance, outside
Sustained.
scope, calling for hearsay.
Sustained.
Back to discuss the newest chapter in the Durst saga is former prosecutor Melba Pearson and co-host Terry Austin. Melba, the prosecution wanted Becerra to show Durst may have known the investigation was reopened, but after the cross, was it worth it?
Well, this is definitely a mixed bag type situation. Definitely, this is a technique to plant the seed in the jury's mind that maybe this could be the motive. Now, granted, they don't have any evidence to back it up, and hopefully, in the jury looking at the case as a whole, will still be able to come to that conclusion from the prosecution's perspective. But again, it's a gamble, because if they're putting out something where there's not a whole lot of evidence to back it up, then, you end up losing credibility and you lose points with the jury. So we'll have to wait and see how this move panned out. But this was to plant the seed in the jury's mind with regards to the motive.
Yeah, let's see how that seed fares. If Lewin waters it with his words, it'll definitely grow. Terry, it seemed like the defense was stopped at every turn by Judge Wyndham. What do you think about his rulings during the cross?
There's no question that Judge Wyndham is leaning backwards for Lewin and the prosecution team. There's no question about that. When on cross-examination, the defense asked Becerra, listen, where did this rumor begin about Susan Berman calling the dean pretending to be Kathie? We get an objection from Lewin. That is the crux of the prosecution's case. That's what they've been talking about and trying to establish. That was theoretically part of the motive behind killing Susan Berman. And yet, the judge sustained the objection by Lewin and said that it wasn't relevant. It is relevant. So I think all in all, the defense is trying very hard to put their case in and just moving on when they are ruled against, because they don't want to look like the judge is ruling against them the entire time.
Yeah, we'll see how this all ties in together. Of course, Prosecutor Lewin is phenomenal in terms of his knowledge of the law. I would not put it past him that these are proper objections, but just from the outside in, it seems like he's having his way with this case, and the defense is just being stopped at every juncture. Thank you both. When we come back, a young woman murdered after getting into the wrong car, thinking it was her Uber ride. The man accused of killing her, now on trial, opening statements after the break. Welcome back. A South Carolina man is now on trial for the murder of a college student who allegedly got into his car thinking it was her Uber driver. 27-year-old Nathaniel Rowland is charged with kidnapping and murdering 21-year-old Samantha Josephson in March 2019. She was last seen on surveillance video around 2 a.m. getting into the back seat of a car she thought was her Uber. According to investigators, the victim's blood and cell phone were found inside Rowland's car. And prosecutors say he was fixated on her, circling around the block until she got in.
Cameras record Nathaniel Rowland's 2017 black Impala as it pulls into a parking space next to where Samantha is waiting by herself for that Uber. And she mistakenly gets into that vehicle owned by the defendant, Nathaniel David Rowland. And we know that to be true because those cameras and 5 points that I mentioned to you captured those things. The evidence will show that after she got into that vehicle, that's the last time that anybody saw her alive. The next time that somebody saw Samantha Josephson, she was found alone in the woods, covered in her own blood, dead. She'd been stabbed multiple times from the bottom of her feet, throughout her torso, throughout her face, her neck, and her head.
Defense attorneys say the victim is not to blame for her murder, nor is their client. They claim someone else was driving his car at the time.
0. That's the amount of DNA on Samantha Josephson's body that matches Nathaniel Rowland. 0. It's not on her clothing. It's not under her ripped and torn fingernails. It's not on her ankles. Nathaniel's DNA is not there, but someone else's is. Multiple someones. And remember those swabs that the crime scene agents took from his car? From the steering wheel, from the gear shift, from the door handles. More DNA that does not belong to Nathaniel Rowland.
Melba, the prosecution made a strong point in saying that Rowland's cell phone was tracked with Samantha's during this entire time. How strong of an opening was this?
I thought it was a pretty solid opening, because he really painted a very visual picture with regards to the amount of trauma that she went through before she died, that she was stabbed from the bottom of her feet all the way up to the top of her head. So it definitely centers the jury on what happened to her, and then also then causes them to ask the question, well, then why is your cell phone tracking with, Miss Josephson's if you weren't involved with her in any way, shape, or form? If somebody else was driving your car, you weren't at the scene, then there's no logical reason for the two cell phones to be together. So I think that they really set a high bar with this opening statement, and we'll definitely see how the evidence pans out, because remember, an opening statement is not evidence. So we're going to have to see what the actual evidence ends up being and how they're going to be able to rebut the points that the defense brought up in their opening.
Yeah, I thought the prosecution opening reminded me of an Olympian. It was lean, strong, and executed almost perfectly. Terry, the defense's opening called Samantha a fighter and pointed to the fact that none of Rowland's DNA was on her in any way, shape, or form, not even under her broken fingernails. What did you think of the opening?
Well, I thought it was lean, strong, and executed perfectly. I thought the defense did a great job here. I didn't like the fact that she started by quoting numbers, because I've heard that before, and it's a little, mundane. But she did say something about not saying anything bad about Samantha. That was good. And the no DNA and the no cuts on the body was good.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us here on Law and Crime Daily. We'll see you next time as we discuss justice in America.